All right, first up we have Dr. Stephen Buggie, going to be talking on parallel printing enhances the Apple II. Thanks, Steve.
Okay, glad to be here, especially with such a big crowd that we have this time. You know, you'd almost expect that with Apple II being around for so many years and many of us getting old, I'm 70 now, that we'd have declining attendance, and it's so great to see that our attendance has gone up and we have many people here for the first time, so welcome. My name is Stephen Buggie. I've been attending KansasFest since 1996, although this is only my 5th time here. And I teach psychology at a college in Gallup, New Mexico. Couple of really short announcements at the beginning. Number one, 2 years ago when I was here, I picked up a VHS videotape called the Apple II Review. This was produced by Two Alive in 1993. It's 53 minutes long. It was on a VHS video, and I recopied it onto this disc. There's about 20 copies of the disc upstairs, and if those run out, if you give me your name and address, I can actually mail you one. Another announcement is that I'm the author of this paper called The Apple Computer Will. I wrote this 2 years ago, and this is to ensure that your Apple stuff, when you eventually pass away, and at age 70, this could happen at any instant, that family members will contact KansasFest and arrange for for your hardware to be transported here. And you could even use this as a model for your own letter, or if you don't want to even bother making your own letter, just cross off my family members' names and give it to your family. It's got the names and phone numbers and emails of 3 people, Sean Fahey, James Littlejohn, and Tony Diaz, who could be contacted to send the truck to your house to pick up your stuff. And I'd recommend getting medium-sized boxes and loading all the stuff into the boxes, and then tell the organizers how many boxes you have. Because if you only got a small number, it'd be better just to mail it to them. They don't want to send a truck out if you only have 5 or 10 boxes. But give this to your family members, and the reason I feel this is important is that my wife has no interest in Apple II whatsoever. She tolerates it in me, since it keeps me out of trouble, but if I didn't do something like this, I know for sure everything I have would be headed to the dump. And so if you write this, talk it over with your family, I think that in most cases that they would follow through on it. I'd recommend don't include this in an official will. My wife and I both have wills written by a lawyer, but I would leave this out of that. This is an informal thing. If you put it into your official will, I think that the lawyer will feel obligated to follow up and make sure it was carried out, and that means further billing to your family. So just do this on an informal basis, and I hope that the garage giveaway continues for many years. I mean, the things that Sean Fahey has will probably run out, but if others do this kind of thing, there'll be fresh things brought in. And I guess the best thing that I have that would cause a cat fight at the pool table would be my flagship GS. It's got Ramfast GS, Ramfast SCSI, and Zip Card, Zip GS in it as well. Okay, now my talk on parallel printers, it's sort of a minor topic. I mean, I think I volunteered I could even do this in 20 minutes. So it's not a really major thing, but it's sort of a thing to bring awareness to everybody that there are some advantages of parallel printing which you do not find in serial printers. They're sort of subtle, but I think that they also have been an inspiration for the USB interface that's been around for about 15 years. Some of these advantage features of the parallel printer interface have also been integrated into the USB interface. Now, I think everybody's aware that there are 2 general categories of interfaces for printers: the serial interface and the parallel interface. Mostly with the Apple II, or pardon me, with Apples in general, including Mac, the serial interface has been popular. This is usually characterized with a round, thin cable, and the 2GS and the 2C and the 2C Plus all have the serial card built into the circuitry on the motherboard. With the 2 Plus and the 2E, it involved an interface card plugged into a slot. Serial interface mostly involves a lot of adjustments. I mean, you can say this increases its flexibility. Adjustments for the baud rate and all these other things that you read about in the Super Serial Card Manual. The manual is really essential to have if you have a serial interface. Without the manual, many people wouldn't be able to use the serial card because I believe the Super Serial Card's got 14 dip switches, doesn't it? Anybody know for sure? It's either two of 6 or 2 of 7, but that's an awful lot of dip switches, and they have to be set properly or your printing doesn't happen. So there is flexibility in the serial interface, but that also means complexity. And without the owner's manual, then you'd really be stuck. Now, I don't think that there's any problem getting the manual for the Super Serial Card. It's the biggest selling serial card of all. I'm sure it's up on a PDF file somewhere up on the internet as well. But what I'm thinking of are these less well-known serial cards. Let's see, I think there's one called Serial. I've never actually used it. I had one once, but I never actually used it. If you got some minor serial card, it might be difficult to find the owner's manual, and that might make it impossible for you to actually put it to use. The parallel cards were mostly used in the PC world, although even Apple made a parallel interface card. In fact, I think I have it right here. Here is the Apple II parallel interface card by Apple, dated 1981. So even Apple did allow for parallel printing, but they promoted the serial interface with all of their computers. It just, this shows it wasn't sort of kept totally out of mind. The parallel interface, see, it's very easy to spot what it is. First of all, it's a wide ribbon type of cable, like this one. Almost looks like keyboard cable in the 2E. But it goes to a connector like this, which is called the Centronics connector. Looks totally different than the DB25 or the Mini DIN 8 that is so common among the Apple serial printers. Another feature that distinguishes the parallel interface is the minimization of dip switches. Now, with the Apple brand parallel card, it does have one row of dip switches there. Most of them don't have any dip switches at all. Here are two that I grabbed from the table upstairs. I'm going to return them to the table. I'll explain why in just a few minutes. But this one is called the Microtech card. You can see it even has very few chips on it. This row of connectors is for the ribbon cable. Here's another one, the Epson parallel card called APL, obviously means Apple. Its connector for the flat ribbon cable is up here. This one has no dip switches whatsoever. And let's see, here's another one. Whoops. Or the PPI expander, again, no dip switches. Now, why dip switches make so much difference is that lacking dip switches makes it totally simple to put in and connect. I mean, there's nothing to adjust. It's like it just uses defaults, but the defaults are correct. And I'd say it makes it so simple and easy. You could say it's so easy even a caveman could do it. Okay. So the dip switches and the complexity are minimized with parallel printing cards. And I think that that can be important, especially if you're dealing with very old stuff. And let's face it, our whole conference is mostly about very old stuff. You find a printer in a thrift shop or a flea market or a yard sale. Usually there won't be any manual with it. And without a manual, you might be handicapped using a serial interface, but not with the parallel. The parallel cards and interfaces are really just plug and play. So simplicity is the hallmark of parallel printing. There was a video 2 days ago on Wednesday where they showed Tim Cook, the current president of Apple, and he was talking about the virtues of simplicity. So I think if Tim Cook were here, he would be nodding his head saying, yep, if there's anything you got to admit about parallel printing, it's simple. And that is a great advantage if you're dealing with things that are 30 or up to 40 years old, because you're never going to be able to find the manuals for things like that. Let's see, there's a lot of interchangeability between serial and parallel. This is something I picked up from the table, and I'm going to return it because I have two of them that are identical to this at home. It's called the Quadram Microphaser. It's a printer buffer or printer spooler. And they come in all variations. I've had all types, but I've really just used one. It's got a choice for input and a choice for output. Let's see, I think the input would be this connector back here, which on this one is a Centronics connector. And the output to the printer, as you can tell from the ribbon cable, it's flat ribbon cable. This is Centronics. So this one would be parallel, and that's the one that's hooked up to my printer at home. By the way, the printer at home is a C-ITO printer. It was the very first one that I ever got. It's never failed, and the interface card that came with the computer when I bought it in 1990, it's now 27 years old, it has never given any trouble either. So I'm using the original interface card from 27 years ago, and the printer, it's a daisy wheel. Its brand is actually Commodore, but it's made by C-ITO company. It's a parallel printer, and I've got one identical to this there. When I say that these are interchangeable, you can get the microphaser with serial in, serial out, serial in, parallel out, or parallel in and serial out. All different combinations are available. Okay? But the reason why I'm returning this to the table is that I expect that this microphaser that I've already got connected to my printer is going to outlive me. And because this stuff just doesn't seem to burn out. I think that parallel cards are probably some of the most reliable interface cards in your entire computer, because I kept buying more and more of them as the years went on. I think at some point I probably had 18 or 20 parallel cards before it dawned on me the original card is never going to give any trouble and never going to burn out. So why do you need that many spares? So I don't need a spare of this thing. I'll put it out on the table. Another great feature of parallel interface that I think is fairly unknown is that coming through the wires of the parallel plug is, I think it's either 5 volts or 12 volts. I'm not sure. I've never bothered to measure it. But like the microphaser here, it's got a socket for an external power supply, but you don't even need to use it. It will get enough power directly through this ribbon cable to operate this thing. Okay, so that's there if you love to use your adapters, but you don't need to use it ever. Okay. When I talk about the interchangeability and of this, you might think, what about those computers that have the serial interface built in, like the GS, the 2C, and the 2C Plus? This is called the Hotlink printer interface by Orange Micro. It's for the 2C. It's got a DIN 5 to plug into the 2C, and then this one goes into the Centronics port on the parallel printer. Let's see, I'll kind of demonstrate it with this. Remember, see, this one's got the Centronics socket. Let's see, how does it go? Let's see, it goes this way. Yeah, you can see it plugs right in. So if somebody had a 2C and maybe bought a parallel printer at a flea market or something like this will work. Now I brought this one with me, but there is something still up there on the table. You know, this parallel stuff just sits everywhere because people maybe not sure how it works. But there's one identical to this that I think says for a 24-pin dot matrix. It's sitting up there. I think this one would go into my daisy wheel printer. But anyway, there's one very similar. If you're still using 24-pin dot matrix, that one is up there hoping to be adopted into a good home. Okay. Durability and reliability, I think, is a very positive feature. That is, I've mentioned several times, these things never seem to burn out. You really don't need a lot of spares of them. And I think the fact that they last so long and work so reliably might be the reason why nobody is interested in getting them on the internet. I actually offered my spare of this. It's still up there on the internet for $6, and nobody is jumping for it because if they're interested, they probably already have one, and why would they even want a spare? Let's see, let me do the pictures. Let's see. By the way, I actually plan to do the talking first, followed by the pictures, because my sequence on the pictures doesn't quite match what I've just been saying, but let's go through this now. Oops. Oh, okay. This is just a picture of that Apple brand parallel card, which you saw here. Okay, I mentioned that. Serial has been mostly Apple, parallel mostly PC and the clones. Let's see, that's the hot link there. Usually the serial cable is round and fairly small. Some of the serial interfaces use a DB25 connector at the end. I think they moved to the mini DIN 8 because most of those pins on the DB25 weren't even being used at all, and it was just a big bulky thing hanging onto the computer. Oh, this is an interesting thing. This is a printer in my garage. I haven't used it for years, but it's called Next Spin Writer. I've had a really big spin writer, and then I have this smaller one. Next Spin Writer is actually more like a deluxe daisy wheel printer. My big one was printing at 70 characters a second. I believe this one prints at about 40 characters a second. Spin Writer's got all of the letters on a little thing, looks like a plastic spindle, like a plastic, thimble, maybe. This thing spins around, and a hammer hits it against the paper. But it's quite a miracle to watch that thing go at 70 characters a second. You really can't even see it stop. I mean, it's spinning, stopping, spinning and stopping, but at 70 characters a second, it looks like just a blur of motion. But I don't think you can see it here too well in this picture, but this one has both interfaces in it. It's got a serial interface on the left side and a parallel Centronics socket on the right side. So I think this one is for those who are undecided or want to try both versions. Everybody is happy with this printer. Oh, good. Wait, there's the better picture of it. That's I think that's a DB25 female socket. This one is the Centronics. So you can pick whichever type you like. Okay, the printer buffer spooler, that's what this thing is. By the way, this particular one, I noticed a little note on it. It's got 32K of RAM. The one I have at home has 128K of RAM. I think if I open this up, you would see a lot of empty RAM sockets because these were mostly designed so that you could put as much as 128 in. And the idea of the printer buffer is that when the computer sends the information out for printing, it goes temporarily into this RAM, and then from the RAM into the printer at whatever speed the printer can handle. Okay. It frees up the computer for doing other things while a long job is being printed. There's the front of the microphaser. That's the one I have at home, but it's identical to this. Yeah, I mentioned all the variations. This one is parallel in, parallel out. This one just to show that DC power socket over here, which is optional to use. It works identically whether you're using external or internal power. The internal power comes directly through the ribbon cable. Let's see, what did I put? Well, flexibility. I guess with a lot of dip switches, does allow for a huge amount of flexibility, but you really need that manual to take advantage of it. Small round cable. Familiarity. I think probably everybody with their first Apple probably started with some kind of serial printer because Apple promoted that. Lack of dip switches. Now this one in the picture actually does have 4 dip switches, but most of them are like this without dip switches. And the fewer dip switches, or the lack of them, makes it easier to use where you can't go wrong. Default assignment. What's meant by that is that when there are no dip switches, there are some standard settings built into the card and built into the printer that are always going to be matching. And you don't need a manual if there is nothing that needs to be reset. I mentioned this earlier that the cable itself provides DC power to operate the card. And then high reliability, these things just never seem to burn out. I mean, if somebody has been into parallel printing, if they got more cards, they are just spares that have never been used. Inexpensive, the cards are so cheap. I think they're probably the least expensive interface cards for the Apple II that are out there. I mean, let's see, one of them, the PP something, where was it? Let's see, darn, I might have left it in the room. I had this one, I think it was called something like PPX. I bought 5 of them brand new in the box for $5 each, but they were in the box with instructions, but I've never used any of them. Now the USB interface, this is really the last topic. I believe that the USB interface, which has been with us for about 15 years, is partly inspired by the parallel printer interface. And the USB interface, I don't know too much about it, but somebody described it as being a high-speed serial interface. But the thing is that there's really nothing to adjust. I can't remember ever using any USB device, so let's say mouse or keyboard or anything else, that required adjustment through dip switches. I think what's happened with the USB, it might be serial on the inside, but they've got standard default settings which are automatically applied, and that keeps it simple for the user. You never have to worry about is the speed rate at the right level or anything. It's all standardized with defaults. And another thing is that the USB interface, of course, has that very handy feature that power goes through that thin wire. I think there are only 4 contacts in the USB. 2 of them must be power, and we use that we use the USB interface to charge up our cell phones and charge up other little things too. And I think that is grew out of the fact that the power, a couple of the lines in the Centronics parallel interface are carrying power. So the USB is simple, standardized, based on defaults, and the same thing applies to USB. And the USB supplies this internal power. No dip switches. So there is the Apple brand parallel card. That's it. Thank you for listening. I finished 4 minutes early. It's quite a challenge for a college instructor because I'm used to talking for an hour and 15 minutes. Yeah?
Yeah, so you said that the serial cable had all the dip switches and gave you flexibility. What kind of options would be interesting?
Oh, you mean in the parallel?
Sorry, no, the serial had all the dip switches. What kind of variations would you want to figure in with the dip switches?
Well, of course, you'd take a look at the Super Serial Card manual, and it's got everything, you know, baud rate, reversible something. I can't remember any more of it, but I know there are just a lot of things. You know, you have 14 dip switches. Now, a few of these parallel cards do have dip switches. This one, called the Grappler Plus, was one of the biggest selling ones, and it's got 4 dip switches. Some of them, this is from the era of daisy wheel printing. This one, the Hot Link, has got one slide switch that says graphics one way and text for the other way. I think if you were using a daisy wheel printer, which only does text, you would just put it on text, and then if it was something like, maybe a image writer, which dot matrix that does graphics, then you just click it over to graphics. So something like that might be done, but the fewer the dip switches, the easier it would be to operate the card if you don't have the manual. You know, if you have 14 dip switches, I just don't think that you're ever going to be able to use that printer at all. The manual is required when there's that much flexibility with that many dip switches. Any other questions? Okay, well, I've finished 1 minute early. Thank you for your attention.